So what is the situation right now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
The situation is pretty calm. People feel protected. We're like this island where we're back to the single digit of new cases every day, and almost all of it from international travelers returning home. And so people are feeling safe. And every 2 weeks, people can get 9 surgical masks if they're adult or 10 children. The social distancing is advisory. There's no penalty, but people are just following the social distancing ideas very diligently. And it is mostly just about putting on a mask if you happen to be indoors and like around 1 meters from people is very mild. And the tourism industry, of course, is taking a hit, as is air travel, but otherwise everyday industries such as restaurants and things like that operate normally. Movies are open, but kind of reconfigure their seatings so that it's below 100 people each in a audience. So life is normal.
Early on, I guess, you know, my expectation would have been that you would have been the second hard hit after China.
That's what everybody expects, including us, right? Which is why we started mitigating last year. Right. Whereas most countries started mitigating this year.
I am actually, you know, what the things you mentioned, you know, federated learning and differential privacy, these are all, as you say, these are great areas of research, areas to, you know, use some of theoretical techniques in practice and maybe get less accuracy, but it doesn't matter in the type of applications that mostly you would be using. But here, this is not the case, right? We're talking about, as you say, single digits. You want to know very accurate information, in very high resolution. And so my question is, when you said it, you got it through you already did some legwork because of SARS to go through the constitutional process and to see what's acceptable, not acceptable. Does this mean what level of privacy is acceptable, or whether it's acceptable in such a situation not to worry about that?
It's about constraining essential freedoms. So during SARS, there was a case where the entire hospital was barricaded and people within there are forbidden to go out, including medical workers. And that, of course, is a constitutional question, whether like not endangering people outside of the hospital warrants putting people essentially within the barricade. And the Constitutional Court says that it is not unconstitutional, but the existing laws are lacking in terms of the due processes involved. And so our laws then went changes that explicitly spells out these processes. And I think the main thing that you're concerned about is about out of purpose use of collected private information. Yeah. And that is in our Privacy Act, which is GDPR compatible-ish. We're getting adequacy soon. So before we get adequacy, I would not say it's fully compatible, but it's very compatible because it's based on a European Union Privacy Act before the GDPR. So it specifically said that you can only use the collected information such as the whereabouts of the phone of the telecom companies if it protects other people, a general public, from harm, and or it protects the person itself from harm. And so in the Constitutional Court ruling, if barricading people so that they cannot leave a institution, a building, is ruled constitutional, then certainly getting this out of purpose signal from the telecom providers is constitutional because it's used for the purpose of digital fence, and digital fence is like in its worst form is exactly the same as a barricade. And it's almost always better than a physical barricade from the constitutional human rights viewpoint. And so the legality of this is not disputed this time.
But even when you talk about this, so saying that the law says that you are allowed to collect information in this particular case of information collection, as long as it helps protect, let's say, the patient himself or the public, then there's a question of whether even there's a restricted amount of information that you can collect, right? Because what's deemed to be necessary and what's not deemed to be necessary. So there's a question.
When we say out of purpose, we mean that the data, we don't actually touch the data collection phase. It is mostly the data processing and application phase. that we're touching. The telecoms are already collecting the signal strengths and things like that. And so the amount of data collected is minimal for people under home quarantine for 14 days. We're just sending them instant messages where they reply, whether their temperature, whether they show symptoms, and any suggestions they have to the quarantine experience. And that's the only data we collect. And so it's minimal, and we can prove it's necessary.
So what I meant is not that you're collecting new data, is that you're processing, are you processing the data of everyone, or are you processing the data of people
people under the home quarantine, and they're clearly informed of it, although there is no consent process, because constitutionally there is no requirement for a consent process.
Okay, so good. So this made sense early on, where you could control sort of the people who would go into quarantine. The situation, I guess,
it's a large amount of people, like 50K, but yes.
The people who went through the border, say, and now they're in quarantine, and now you want to make sure that they are not leaving the quarantine, right? Or if they are, who they're meeting. And those people are going to be, or that's not a question at all. It's just a question of, at that point, it was just a question of enforcing the rules of staying in quarantine.
That's right. And if they break out of the quarantine, of course, the automated system, as you see on the picture, notices the county governments, the neighborhood managers, the police dispatch if they went too far from the quarantine, if necessary. And of course, we then use the digital fence tracking to make sure that if they significantly overlap with other people's phones, then they may be also at risk. But that is only if you escape quarantine.
Okay, so I guess, I mean, like say they went to the store or something because they need to.
Exactly.
So this part of the finding out whether they overlapped with someone else's phone. That means one has to have access to the information of the other phones as well, right? And, or either by, and then checking that whether the GPSs are in the same place or suitably defined, or the Bluetooth talks about.
Yeah, we don't. I don't think we use signals other than the ones provided by the telecoms. So it's mostly base station data. And so it's developed by, this system is developed in Taiwan. It's one of the major telecoms, the Zhonghua Telecom, developing it. But the other 4 telecoms voluntarily participated. So they settle on an API so that even across different telecom providers, the system can calculate proximity. And
the thing is, I guess, that the issues that people are dealing with right now is who is doing the reporting. So obviously, and who's entitled to that information. Obviously, the telephones companies have that information. Another question is whether they, does it ever leave the phone or doesn't it leave the phone? Is it the user who is its phone you probably have heard this particular idea of a scheme just because it's probably the first thing people come up with, where your phone generates some random numbers every time it's in a location. There's a random number in a location. And then later people who have been in the same, if you get sick, you kind of advertise those random numbers and somebody can go.
Of course. So something like that exists at the application layer. It's the location history tool, and it's developed by civil society here in Taiwan, but it's also been incorporating data from Korea as well as from Israel. And so it relies on an application level feature of Google called location history, which is for a phone installing Google Maps or an Android phone in general, that enable location history tracking. Then you get the Google Maps timeline. And so the basic idea of this simple tool, which is the web-based tool, is that it automatically ask you to download the last period of your Google history, as well as any API compatible trails, of course, and also downloads the available data of specific cases so that it calculates overlaps entirely locally. And well, it doesn't tell you what to do, right? It just shows how the contact worked. And in this way, the history of your local location history is not shared. It doesn't really leave your phone. It's between you and data sources.
Okay, so it's me. So I on my phone, within my phone, it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell whether I was in proximity of
Mm-hmm.
someone and I should be.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not only me that knows that. That also that information also goes to.
No, the information with this tool, because this tool is general purpose. It's not, it's for people not under home quarantine. So we do not have the constitutional right to force them to share anything.
Let's,
And
so, but how do you want,
yeah.
so still, let's say they were exposed. Now
Mm-hmm.
they know that they were exposed because their phone tells them that.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, they are at risk. They are at risk to society possibly because they can transmit it further.
Right, so they wear a mask and get a check from the local clinic.
So how do they, but my question is, how do you enforce that? I mean,
We do, well, we, through, I guess that's how, like asking how do we enforce washing your hands with soap. We do not enforce that, but people do that.
True. Okay. So the assumption here is that people are going to report, in some sense, take care of themselves, or go and ask.
Well, because people don't want to be sick, and we have a single payer health system. They're not going to pay much for the treatment, and the surgical masks are plentifully available. So putting on a mask, protecting others, going to a clinic, get a check is the logical thing to do if you know that you're going to be protected and you're not going to cause a fortune.
So essentially what you're saying is that the privacy issues then are between the telephone company, which has the information anyway, and yourself.
Yes.
That's what
or between Google and you, but yes.
And those are people who haven't been quarantined. For people who have been quarantined, then it's a regular question, that they're part of the system, the governmental system that wants to make sure that they're obeying the rules and is able to track their movements.
Whereabouts, yes.
Whereabouts, yeah. So there's a system here. And obviously it's been successful, but are there statistics really about this application that the telecom company has about the quality of this proximity checking? And is there any kind of feedback from this
yeah,
experiment?
Of course, every person under quarantine, as I said, other than their temperature and their symptoms, we collect their feedback to the system. And so it's continuously being updated by people's feedback. And there's a lot of challenges, of course. There would be, for example, spammers that masquerade as the SMS checkers. And we solve that using crowdsourcing. It's called Who's Call, is another technology. Or we switch to the Line system, which has a verified account. It's like WhatsApp. And a chatbot can automate most of the daily checking so that we free up some chores from the local managers. And there's also the challenge of people simply going into the quarantine, not expecting to pay for the accommodation, but actually the compensation comes after the accommodation. So if people come to Taiwan but with no cash and so on, the local government need to find them somewhere. And so there's dedicated dormitories and now hotels dedicated for this purpose. But the volume went beyond the original expectations, but now we've been expanding such accommodation places and so on. So, I mean, it's a daily improving system. So what we're describing now may well change tomorrow, but the constitutional and algorithm spirit stays the same.
And in terms of international collaboration, so there are people, there's the Taiwan system, and then people are leaving Taiwan, saying they're going to another airport, or whether they're doing it now or not doing it in the future. There's going to be a lot of travel, so there has to be a lot of collaboration between governments, I assume. So is there any thought given to that? Again, there's a question of privacy of your citizens, protected by your constitution.
Yeah, I mean, our citizens can return anytime, right? But currently we're banning all foreigners arriving to Taiwan unless for a specific purpose and they need to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. So in this time period, the problem you raised does not present itself. But eventually, of course, we need to solve that.
Eventually, there has to be some kind of, it has to be, if we want to continue with this idea that we can travel globally and do business globally, it requires being there in person. There has to be some thinking about how much.
Yeah, or maybe everybody switch to telepresencing and immersive reality and massively cut down the carbon emission.
Yeah, there has been talk about that. certainly there's some upsides to this shelter and home. One other thing that kind of, it's not necessarily privacy related, it's not privacy related, but you know, when I read about it in the beginning is that you were checking for symptoms for people arriving from Taiwan. But as far as they understand now, that a lot of people are asymptomatic. Any thoughts about that? That there are people that your system didn't, you know, check mark as going into quarantine?
Well, if they're showing symptoms, they're going to a hospital. They're not going into home quarantine.
Oh, I see. Everybody gets quarantined unless they have symptoms, then they go to hospital.
Right. The difference is just between if you show symptoms, then you go to a hospital for quarantine. If you're coming from a highly dangerous area, highly risky area, then the entire airplane goes into a quarantine center, and not the airplane itself, all the passengers. But if you're from a mild place, then and you show no symptoms, then you're put into the digital fence and you're at your home during the 14-day quarantine. But everybody's quarantined. Yeah, I think it's has a lot to do with the hospital's preparedness. If the hospital has what we in the computer science called redundancy or high availability plans, then you can afford to do that. But if you don't, then the hospital itself need to undergo reconfiguration, and certainly it cannot overwhelm itself during the reconfiguration. So again, it is a question of preparedness.
Yeah, and this is you're saying as a result of the SARS that.
Yes, we were not prepared during the SARS, and we decided 37 people died. Is 37 people too many? And so there was a whole recap of not just the medical procedures, but as I mentioned, the constitutional rulings and things like that.
Do you find that you have a lot of people coming to you for finding out like what I'm doing right now, what you've done?
Yes, and we there's a lot of publications as well on journals, but a lot of focus that we're putting on now is on useful knowledge sharing between bilaterals, because every municipality, to be precise, every outbreak epicenter is very different. And so we think it's very useful to work bilaterally instead of a kind of universal playbook thing.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. So you're working with Israelis, I understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're so I personally did not have calls with people in Israel, but we understand that our, for example, Department of Cybersecurity and so on did do briefings on many countries with similar values, but I don't know whether it includes Israel or not. We do know that, that your Prime Minister cited us as an example of the digital fence, and that apparently has some constitutional controversies watching from afar. But I did not have any conversations, nor do I know anyone who did have direct conversation with your Prime Minister.
Very interesting. And you know, about all the other things on days in a usual day, like federated learning or the French privacy, what we're doing with NPC, homomorphic encryption, you know, it's sort of a anti-money laundering type of use of encryption, and which is very similar to what you need here, right? You need to query
exactly
sort of information and only get back without letting them know what you're querying and so forth. I'd be very happy to talk to you in the future.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for your time.